In the year 2038, deep in a snow-covered forest in Japan, stationed halfway a snow-capped mountain near Kyoto, in a secret facility codenamed The Garden, George Almore is an electrical mechanical engineer and a scientist on a lonely mission to restart a decommissioned base. It is an unwelcoming concrete palace, as cold as the inside as the weather on the outside, like a spaceship plopped on another planet. The movie begins as George takes a brisk run in the cold forest, and he was communicating over his earpiece with J2, the robot that he built for company. He is checking to see if the security cameras work, and after he returns from his jog, an IoT greets him as he walks inside. And after a quick shower, he has a conversation with J2 about the security cameras, and they reroute the power together. J1 is also another robot he created for company, and she greets him warmly, and George opens a cartoon show for her to watch. And J2 tells George about the dream that she keeps seeing repeatedly of her and George driving in a car. She says she doesn't remember anything else besides that, and she felt sad after waking up. And George left J1 and J2 to make a video call with his dead wife, Jules Almore. George finds comfort away from work while talking to his wife. You're probably wondering, if his wife is dead, how does he talk to her? And how he does it is through this technology called the archive. The archive is a technology that can extract and store a dead person's consciousness in analog format to allow 200 hours of interaction with the deceased. And while Julie was against the idea, George went ahead and registered them both without her knowing. When she found out, she was pretty pissed about it and they had a big argument, but he still did it anyways. And Jules is now dead due to a car accident, and her consciousness is stored in the archive. And through their video call interaction, he told her how much he misses her, of course, and Jules starts crying, saying that it's getting harder for her to talk to him like this, and she's hoped that he's happy, and George tells her that he's kind of happy, and he's at a very beautiful place. And after the I love yous, they ended their call to preserve the amount of time that they had. And here we see George remembering a time when he and his wife were in a self-driving car, going somewhere. And his flashback is interrupted when his boss Simone calls him. Simone is his reporting manager, expecting results from his robots that he's supposed to be working on. And she says that she's gonna shut him down since there is no progress on his work. This is because she's unaware of his second prototype, J2 and J3. And J2 was eavesdropping on their conversation, and George told her to stay out of sight while he is on a conference call. And Simone ended the call after warning him to work on the security system, and J2 doesn't really like Simone. She calls her a bitch. And George is working on a model, his third prototype, J3, and this is a true human equivalent android. And he's trying to resurrect his wife's consciousness through his new work, J3. And later on, J2 and George were working outside when J2 asked him why he's working on this new prototype alone. She says to him that his new prototype is going to be better than she is better than J1, and she seems a bit jealous because she thinks that J3 is going to replace her. George assures her that that's not really the case, and J3 can never replace her. And after they go back inside, George wakes J3 up from her hibernation, and she goes into shock as she screams in horror. And then George goes to a vehicle storage where he's met face to face with a wolf that broke into his house. J1 starts whimpering as George chased the wolf outside, but the system failed as he commanded the house to close the doors. And George and J1 went outside to fix the doors in the security system, and George found a new device attached to the door component. He asked J1 if she knows anything about it, but she swears that it wasn't her. And it's obvious that it's her because she's been acting really weird lately. And meanwhile, two cars approach their house and ask for entry, and they say that they're here about his wife, and George lets them in. And then George commands J1 and J2 to go back into their base and play dead until the visitors are gone. And the two vehicles enter the base, and the visitors are from the archive company, and they perform an inspection on the device. And Jules has been dead for about 2 years, 8 months, and 4 days now. And George points out that she can call him, but the line doesn't work when he calls her. And one of these visitors, named Vincent, says that that can happen since her time is getting shorter in the archive. He implies that the archive calls mostly end with audio calls because the signal fades out. And the other visitor, Mr. Melvin, notes that the security seal is broken and he threatens legal action. However, George points out that they are on his company's property and hints at the legal repercussions of a confrontation. And the archive team backs off and leaves. And later that day, we witness J3 waking up, and she's panicking and doesn't remember who she is. And she wanted to know where she is, and George opens the window and shows her what's on the outside. And the next morning, George tests J3's sensory of tastes, and she recognizes all types of tastes. And then he gives her a VR machine to play games with animals, and in it to test her empathy and feelings. And she responded very well. And J3 got curious about the other robots in the house, and George told her everything she needs to know. George George is mostly alone except for the 3 robotic prototypes that he's created to save his wife's essence. He created 3 distinct AIs, J1, J2, and J3, with each new model resembling his wife in both behavior and appearance than the last. And on top of that, their maturity becomes more developed with each new model. The first attempt left him with a lumbering, gentle giant, much like a toddler who can't speak, named J1. J1 acts like a child, and she stopped aging around the age of 5 or 6. And the second AI, named J2, is slightly more developed, taking on a more temperamental adolescent's mindset, and she's also stopped developing around the age of 15 to 16. And she acts like a petulant child when his attentions move on to creating a more humanoid version, which of course is skinnier, smaller, and more conveniently attractive, and is just better in every sense than the previous model, which is J2. And J3 is a very adult functioning prototype. It interacts very well with human mannerisms and has very good responses and shows emotion. And George christens them all sisters and tries to get them to unite for a purpose of bringing Jules back. They each have varying degrees of his wife in them somehow, and George wants to bring them all together. And George has used the analog signals of Jules to get from J1 to J2 to J3. And once J3 can operate independently, he plans to erase J3's personality and replace it with Jules. And outside, George was working on the security system when he catches what seems to be a helicopter near the station. And the station lights keep going out, and J3 hurried him to come back inside. And the place is apparently falling apart. And a while later, Simone contacted George and informed him about a man called Mr. Tag, who got a new security procedure for him. But George says that he won't let him inside the research facility since there are robots and he doesn't want the archive company to find out. So he schedules the meeting in another place. And Mr. Tag tells George that he's being watched, and he shows him pictures of him sleeping in his bed that was taken 2 nights ago. And George demands to know who took the pictures, but Mr. Tag himself doesn't know either. And Mr. Tag gives him his new procedures, and he warns him not to use them unless it's an emergency. And back at home, George wakes up from a horrific nightmare as the house alarm goes off, detecting a breach at the residential area. And J3 is not where she was supposed to be, and George opens the emergency box that he received earlier, and the alarms went off again, closing the doors around him. He assures Tag, saying that he was just curious to see what was on the inside and to turn off the alarms now. And George found J3 inside the storeroom while he was trying to get some accessories, and she actually strangles him and she curses at his face. And he tries to calm her down, and she tells him about what happened. It was apparently J2 who was jealous of her, and she tried to get rid of her. And before he can address the situation, George gets a call from his boss Simone, who implies that he may be in trouble for his actions during the archive team's visit. She tells him that they think that his robots are based on the archive's technology, and he assures her that she has nothing to worry about. And after, George decides to take away J2's legs and give it to J3. And this was the final blow, as J2 feels entirely abandoned, and she's confronted with the realization that she will never be anything more or better than she already is. And because of this fact, she says goodbye to J1, her sister, and she destroys herself by walking into a lake. And in the coming days, George and J3 grew more connected with each other. Their time together at first seems rather sweet, but as the film goes on, J3 attempts at assimilating to real life, and becoming more intimate with George becomes ever more difficult and challenging. And one night, J3 tried to get into bed with him, and he jumps away from her because these creations of his are more like his children that just have his dead wife's personality and memories. And Simone makes another call regarding J2, and the archive company fished her out of the lake, and the team is on its way to shut down George's research. And he makes the final call to his wife on the archive's machine, and he ends the call saying, "I'll see you soon." And J3 overhears this and realizes her purpose, and that her own consciousness will be rewritten by George's wife, who will live in her body. And J3 finally challenges him and questions if the choices that he's making are moral and also the right thing to do. She starts to think about her own worth and purpose because she now has a personality of her own. And George discloses to J3 that he plans on erasing her and replacing her with Jules' consciousness, but like any living being, J3 doesn't want to die. And here we see an amazing plot twist that I did not see coming. Though initially afraid and angry, J3 accepts her fate, and she decides to let George override her consciousness. And then J3 wakes up and acts like she's Jules, and George is very much so overjoyed with this. And he does this very last minute The people from the archive company were at his doorsteps trying to get in, and the company's recovery team that was coming in, that was trying to get in, all of a sudden disappear and everything is calm. And his robots also disappear. And then the archive starts ringing with an incoming call from Jules. And despite J3's urgency for George not to answer, he picks it up anyways, and we hear a final goodbye from Jules and their child. Apparently, Jules was pregnant during their car accident. And as it turns out, George was the one that died in the accident, and Jules and the child are actually alive in the real world. What we have been witnessing is his soon-to-go subconscious crafting its own reality, likely as a way of coping with his wife's loss. We can see that the AIs are not only as George's own literal way of bringing back his wife, but the AIs themselves and their advancement can be seen as representation of his own stage of acceptance with her loss. And J1, being the youngest and the silent one, almost can't comprehend the situation. J2, meanwhile, is the most needy and clingy, highlighting George's own emotional vulnerability. And J3, the mature one, is the closest to providing the same kind of human companionship as his wife, and can be seen as she is trying to move on from what happened. And on the ride where George tells Jules about his 3-year research grant, they have the accident, and contrary to what the audience is made to believe, George dies and Jules survives. And since George was signed up for archive, his consciousness is ported onto the device, and over 4 years, Jules has been visiting him and chatting with him through the analog consciousness. Only the flashbacks leading up to the car accident are real, and everything else that George has been doing in Japan is created by his own consciousness as a coping mechanism and is not real. And J2 is part of George's subconscious, and he is guilty about the fact that he drove on manual mode and that he's responsible for the death of his child, and he creates a situation where he neglects the results of the death of J2, which is actually his child. And at the end of the movie, Jules musters up the courage to get their daughter to talk to George, and as they say their final goodbyes, tear rolls down George's face, and he continues to finally accept the truth, and he fades out of existence. And that is how the movie ends. I hope you guys enjoyed our recap. I hope to see you guys on my next recap. Remember to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.